This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And this is part 2 of Emma Goldman. When we last left our young anarchist, she was in a bit of a pickle. She had gotten herself accused of being part of a conspiracy to do a little bit of assassination. But she's out of jail. She's free.
She's out of jail. She's free. She's good to go. Despite having been accused without any evidence of being behind the attempted assassination of Henry Clay Frick, and having been convicted of inciting a riot in New York, despite that riot never actually happening. That's okay. She's feeling good. She's ready to go. She's back out of prison. So from this point forward, last time was about Emma Goldman's kind of origin as an anarchist figure. From this point onward, I am not going to do a blow-by-blow of her life because it just gets way too complicated. We would be here for a while. Instead, I'm just going to quickly go over where she's at when she gets out of prison. We'll talk a bit about her politics, and we'll talk a bit about a few different points where she runs afoul of the law. So, as a quick reminder, she gets out of prison in 1893 for incitement to riot. And from there, she'll briefly go actually to London for a bit to pick up a side gig. She'll actually become a licensed nurse and then come back to the United States and kind of make a living working as a midwife and a nurse in combination with her lecturing circuit as an anarchist, because she is now one of the faces of American anarchism. Those tours are very popular. Apparently, she's one of the first anarchist speakers to go on a speaking tour of the West Coast. I tried to find anything she'd done in Seattle. I'm not totally sure that she made it all the way up here. I know she made it as far as Portland. So, she definitely made it into the area.
I mean, there was definitely some very famous labor agitation happening in Seattle at the time, so she could have stopped by.
I mean, I imagine even if she didn't make it out here, and I just couldn't find anything one way or another, but I'm not an expert on this period, her ideas certainly did.
So I'm curious. I know that just talking about her being a midwife is just her day job, which is not the thing that most people remember her for. But I also remember this being a period of time where maternal care and care of babies was, let's say, not ideal, especially really showed off class stratification. Did she do any writing about how what she saw in that job affected some of what was going on with her political philosophy?
Quite a bit. And I mean, this is the thing where I just have to I have to say up front, Emma Goldman wrote so much that unless you are an absolute expert on her thinking, I don't think it's really possible to be familiar with all of it. She had a lot to say. I've read some of her stuff about kind of gender politics, and one of the things she talks about is the structure of childcare being like a way to imprison women essentially in relation to men. And one of her goals, one of the things that makes her kind of controversial among anarchists is her advocacy for kind of social liberation of women to go along with the political liberation promised by anarchism. The idea being that, actually, I have a quote from an interview she gave to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The interviewer is asking her, "Aren't women free?" "Free? Woman is the slave of her husband and her children. She should take part in the business world the same as the man. She should be as equal before the world as she is in the reality. She is as capable as he, but when she labors, she gets less wages. Why? Because she wears skirts instead of trousers." And then the follow-up question is, but what is to become of the ideal home life and all that now surrounds the mother, according to a man's idea? Her response, ideal home life indeed. The woman, instead of being the household queen told about in storybooks, is the servant, the mistress, the slave of both husband and children. She loses her own individuality entirely. Even her name she is not allowed to keep. She is the mistress of John Brown or the mistress of Tom Jones. She is that and nothing else. That is the way I think of her.
You know what? I am picking up exactly what Emma Goldman is putting down here. I recall this is also the era of sort of the construction of a certain kind of domestic ideal that wasn't really that historical and wasn't really that possible for a lot of American society, right? But this is sort of the era of the invention of what we now think of as the housewife, right?
Yes, this is the age of the origin of the cult of true womanhood, as it's sometimes called. And it's, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about Goldman in relation to that is that on the one hand, it makes her kind of this like magnet of controversy. It is part of what draws people to oppose her, but it also gives her a sort of cross-party appeal. She's one of very few anarchists who draws in large numbers of non-anarchists to her speeches, especially women. And a lot of that is because she appeals also to like what we might call progressive or liberal reformers who maybe are not anarchists, but share some of her views about gender politics. And so she can kind of like appeal to those people and build what we might call some coalition politics, if we want to get a little fancy with our language.
Yeah, honestly, a lot of what she's saying is making a lot of sense to me. I'm not really so down on the uh, poorly attempting to assassinate people angle, but a lot of her politics are actually still resonating here.
Allegedly, she was involved in that.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Actually, we got another assassination to talk about soon, but
Okay, let's go.
well, before that, so okay, you're down with. I have four kind of main points in her worldview. I'm taking a lot of this from Alice Wexler's biography of Emma Goldman, by the way. And Wexler's fourth point about Goldman's politics is the kind of like the gender politics she brings to the table. So let's talk about point number one then. Okay, so you're down for Emma Goldman's gender politics. Do you share her fundamental opposition to the state? All states, they're all illegitimate, including democracies, because they rely on subordinating individual free will to the majority and delegating your right to make your own decisions to representatives.
Well, Emma, I'm not really sure how society is going to function at scale without some civil servants.
Yeah, I mean, this is the like just to remind everyone, I'm not an anarchist. I like to think I'm a little bit familiar with the theory, but I'm certainly not an expert. Last I checked, Demetria, you're not an anarchist either, but it has been a little while.
I would say no. I very much enjoy my roads and my social programs.
Yeah, so this is very much, I think, Goldman's kind of Kropotkinite anarchism coming out. It's very idealized. There's this notion, again, that humans are sort of naturally social and don't need elaborate social or political structures. We have this kind of natural desire to work together.
I would say yeah. A lot of the anarchists that I've met are very idealistic that way, and I would say I'm a little bit less idealistic about human nature than a lot of the folks I've met and debated politics with.
I definitely I respect it. I don't agree with it, but I do respect it. I also don't necessarily agree with Goldman telling her followers that they shouldn't participate in electoral politics because they give the illusion of choice without reality, because the ballot is, quote, simply a means for the transference of rights of the people to the control of rulers. Whenever the people shall have arrived at a knowledge of the true principles governing harmonious social relations, they will put them into practice without the ballot box. I don't know about that. I mean, democracy is not perfect, but, you know.
Yeah, that's very convenient to not actually have to do anything in a democracy and simply wait for the revolution that will overthrow the democracy. That does take a lot of the responsibility of maintaining a structure off of your shoulders as a citizen.
Yeah, I mean, she does have, you know, a positive direction to tell people what to do. She's not a ballot organizer, but she is a labor organizer, and she's big into direct action. So organizing strikes, demonstrations, and like alternative anarchist co-ops or anarchist schools. She will say in one of her interviews, direct action against the authority in the shop, direct action against the authority of the law, direct action against the invasive, meddlesome authority of our moral code is the logical, consistent method of anarchism.
I will say, in fairness, I know a thing or two about how elections were run in this time period, especially local elections. And just like even the things that I don't agree with that she's saying here, I see how someone with her life experience would have come to that conclusion. Having lived through the time period that she lived through in the places that she was living, I see how she would be a little bit suspicious of the electoral system.
I think that's fair enough. Yeah. I'm always a little bit shaky with the direct action stuff because it's never clear to me how that's supposed to translate into actual long-term systemic change. It always seems like that gets hand waved a little bit. Um, but I think like you said, I can see how someone could arrive in a logically consistent way at this kind of conclusion. Point number three in Emma Goldman's ideology is her extreme hatred of religion. She calls Christianity admirably adapted to the training of slaves, and just generally seems to enjoy scandalizing people by really going like attacking Christianity as a moral and social institution.
Okay, you know what? Again, in fairness, knowing where she came from and knowing how Christianity was used against people in the Russian Empire, and then moving to America and knowing these strains of Christianity that were dominant at the time that she is saying these things and what that was used against people to do. There's a point there. I'm not saying all religion automatically slavery, but I see where that idea came from to her.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely partially she just kind of enjoys fucking with people and she knows that'll get a response out of middle class Americans. But I can see where she is coming from. If you are wondering, because we did talk a bit about her Jewish origins, is that the phrase? Last time, she doesn't talk as much about Judaism in a lot of her interviews, but she mentions it occasionally. From what I can kind of infer, the ethical tradition of Judaism was still very important for her. She did get kind of a traditional education that, in kind of the Orthodox style that would have familiarized her with that. But she also seems to have felt, and I don't know that I fully, and I don't know that I disagree, that ethical tradition was bogged down by an excessive focus on ritual rather than the ideals behind the rituals, which I don't fully disagree with. I think that can happen in some strands of Judaism.
I do also want to point out a lot of those rituals have some questionable gender assumptions going into
Certainly,
them.
in the
And
Orthodox tradition that she
yeah,
was raised in, that is very true.
especially conservative dad who wanted to be an Orthodox rabbi, I would imagine, was not going with the modern reform significantly different interpretations of the purpose of some of those rituals.
Yeah, I think Emma Goldman would have really enjoyed a Reconstructionist synagogue. Mostly because they like to argue.
I would love to talk to Emma Goldman about periods. I'm just saying, I think she would have had a lot to say.
Speaking of which, we touched a little bit on point four already, which is her views on gender. This is what really I think separates her from a lot of other anarchists. Most of this stuff is pretty conventional in the kind of Kropotkinite wing of anarchism, but her gender politics are way more at the forefront than a lot of the other men who are kind of the faces of anarchism during this period. We've talked about her views on gender equality. We also briefly mentioned her views on free love from the same interview that I quoted earlier about gender relations in the household. That interviewer would ask her later on, "What do you call love?" Her response was, "When a man or a woman finds some quality or qualities in another that they admire and has an overweening desire to please that person, even to the sacrificing of personal feeling, when there is that subtle something drawing them together that those who love recognize and feel it in the inmost fiber of their being, then I call it love." Follow-up question, can a person love more than one at the same time? I don't see why not. If they find the same lovable qualities in several persons, what should prevent one loving the same things in all of them? So this is a pretty big departure from the rest of the anarchist movement, which is way more like focused on kind of political and economic exploitation and less so on the social sphere, and especially in terms of talking about gender and free love and all that. Also want to note, as we mentioned last time, Emma Goldman was almost certainly bisexual herself. There's pretty good evidence for that, and would repeatedly get in trouble. She actually got harassed by cops in Portland during her tour there because she said in a speech that there was nothing wrong with being homosexual. And so she was charged for public indecency for saying that, but was eventually released without a trial.
Yeah, I mean, I'm picking up a lot of things that I am agreeing with here, and I am really actually quite astonished how modern a lot of the things she's saying is. We talked about this a little bit in the previous episode about the other anarchist leader who wanted to make her into a good little housewife. It seems like the anarchist movement, as it exists in this time period, is not exactly able to separate some of their biases from the atmosphere in which all of this is taking place in.
I would say that's very fair, yeah. And Goldman, I think part of what makes her so notorious is that she is very different from those guys, and it, draws in scandal because of that, but also draws in attention outside of the usual anarchist constituencies. You know what else gets her a lot of attention? When she is implicated in the assassination of the American president.
Oh boy, okay, which one? Which one?
Well, of course, we all remember President William McKinley. We remember him so well that I forgot to look up which number of president he is. I'm not, probably 20-something, right? Who cares? Anyway, September 6, 1901, good old Willie McKinley is 6 months into his second term as president. He's in the great city of Buffalo, New York. Unfortunately, too early for the invention of buffalo wings, but right in time for the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. And he's a man of the people. He's gotten some death threats from anarchists before, but he doesn't want too much separation between him and his constituents. He likes to glad hand. And so he's going around, shaking hands, meeting people, working the crowd, when an unemployed Polish-American former factory worker, whose name I'm going to probably mangle a little bit, Leon Salgaz, pulls out a gun and shoots McKinley twice in the chest. McKinley will briefly seem like he's going to recover, but then the wound will turn septic and he will die on September 14th, making him, of course, the third American president to be assassinated after Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. He is actually the reason the Secret Service exists after his assassination. That's when the Congress starts to shift a mandate to protect the president over to the Secret Service. And of course, he's most famous because before he died, he picked a vice president by the name of Mr. Teddy Roosevelt, who would go on to be something of a big deal when he became president. But, Rip McKinley, I guess.
They just don't make presidents like czars. They just do not stand up to anarchist assassination attempts in the same way.
Yeah, he's decidedly less bomb-proof than Alexander II, which I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the merits of democracy from that fact. So the important thing for us, Leon Salgaz is obviously nabbed by the cops. He's interrogated, and he'll tell them, I am an anarchist. I struck out at McKinley because I'm an anarchist, and I want to engage in this propaganda of the deed. I want to, assassinate people to draw attention to the cause. And he says, I was inspired to do this by a speech given by, who do you think?
Oh, is Emma Goldman going to be in trouble for incitement to assassination here?
Exactly. What he will say is that he saw Goldman speak in the great city of Cleveland, Ohio. In May of 1901, she gave a speech called The Modern Phases of Anarchy, and that it, quote, set him on fire, after which he resolved to do something heroic for the cause I loved.
Okay, so we're going to get into some really interesting law here because there is, the First Amendment, big fan of it, does protect a lot of speech in the United States, however, does not protect all speech. Incitement to murder is not something that is protected under the First Amendment, and I am very curious to see where the courts are going to draw this line.
Yeah, so this is going to be an interesting one because there's not really any evidence that ties Goldman to directly saying, hey, go shoot the president. Looking retrospectively at it, it's pretty clear that Leon Salgaz was frankly just obsessed with Emma Goldman, basically had the hots for her and just shot the president to get Senpai to notice him.
You know what? Wouldn't be the first of Goldman's boyfriends to shoot somebody, so I don't know, maybe it would have worked.
Certainly would have gotten her attention. It did get her attention. So apparently he will actually try to get into the home of some of her friends in Chicago in July under a false name. Basically saying he was really inspired by Goldman to join the movement. He pulled her aside briefly when she was glad handing after that speech in May to get a reading list from her, essentially. He's trying to get noticed. And he did, but not in a great way. One of Goldman's allies at this point, another Jewish anarchist, Abraham Isaac, was convinced that Solgaz was a spy for the U.S. government, and actually put out a warning saying that in the September 1st issue of the publication he edited called Free Society. So like Salgaz is not like he's trying to get into the movement, and it's quite possible that he shot the president basically to prove that he was a dedicated anarchist and that he wasn't a government spy, which they all thought he was.
Oh, I guess that is the eternal problem in, I guess, fringe movements of all types, of that you do not know who is a genuine comrade and who might have some ulterior motives for being there.
So, regardless of motives, people get a little ornery when you try and shoot the president, shockingly enough. And so after the assassination, there is this mass moment of anti-anarchist hysteria, rounds of arrests, mob violence actually targeting anarchists. Johann Most, that guy who tried to make Emma Goldman into a housewife, will actually get a year in prison right after this because he made the unfortunate mistake of printing an essay defending the assassination of kings in Europe the day before McKinley was shot.
Oops. Okay. I'm curious about some of the First Amendment protections on that one, because that one seems like a vaguer incitement to violence than one normally gets a year in prison for.
If you think that's bad, Leon Salgaz's trial is fucking insane. It's like he did shoot the president, to be clear, but that trial is a fucking mess. So he does that on September. Let me double check my date, 6th here, just to make sure. His trial is 2 days long. It takes place September 23rd to 24th, so he has no time to prepare a defense. The defense counsel, who is a public defender, will apologize for defending this person. He will actually get up and say, "I'm sorry, I have to do this." That defense counsel brings in an alienist, essentially an early psychiatrist, to try and make some kind of insanity defense. But they don't really try that hard, and Solgas's own family say that they think he's, completely nuts. Most of the jurors have obviously made up their mind before anything gets said. Say it's a 2-day trial for shooting the president, and then he's immediately convicted and sentenced to be hanged.
Oh,
This is not a moment where the American legal system covers itself in glory, and I think you can see that in how Emma Goldman gets handled here too.
that's fascinating. Actually, we covered the attempted assassination of Andrew Jackson, and that trial. Actually, I kind of wonder if the defense was modeled after that trial, because that was a successful, even before the insanity defense was really codified. I'd call that kind of a proto-successful insanity defense. But that is definitely not what happened here.
No, it's pretty bad. I mean, this is an early era of real anti-left hysteria that's going to continue to build from this point forward when we look at World War I especially, but you can see it here too. And Emma Goldman catches some flack for it too. The police in New York begin to suspect immediately that she's behind the assassination. She'll briefly go on the lam, but turn herself over to the cops in Chicago on September 10th. And basically follows her usual playbook, and is not really in that much legal danger. She's released on the 23rd, the 24th, because there's no evidence to continue holding her. But in the meantime, is very kind of public in defending Leon Salgaz. She says in an interview with the New York Times, quote, Leon Salgaz, I am convinced, planned the deed unaided and entirely alone. There is no anarchist ring that would help him. There may be anarchists who would murder, but there are also men in every walk of life who sometimes feel the impulse to kill. I do not know surely, but I think Salgaz was one of those downtrodden men who see all the misery which the rich inflict on the poor, and resolve to strike a great blow, as they think, for the good of their fellow men. But that is not anarchy. Salgaz may have been inspired by me, but if he was, he took the wrong way of showing it. So it's kind of an equivocation. She'll continue to defend him. She'll call him the man with a man with a beautiful soul of a child and the energy of a giant. So pitiful in his loneliness, and yet so sublime in his silence and superiority over his enemies.
So I'm starting to notice something here, which is that Emma Goldman is saying, do not participate in democracy. It's a system that is not representing you. There is a better option out there after the state collapses and we go back to a more basic state of society. I I'm a little bit confused about how she's sort of skimming over the state will collapse somehow. I'm not saying there should be a violent uprising, but I don't see any other way the state's just going to spontaneously crumble here.
I mean, I do wonder if maybe she's just trying to not get arrested. But she does, she continues to very publicly defend Salgaz, which does draw a lot of heat her way. And actually, like, this does lead to what I'd call kind of a split between her and the rest of the anarchist movement, because a lot of anarchists, including, like, for example, Alex Berkman, her boyfriend, who is still in prison for trying to kill Henry Clay Frick, will disavow Salgaz very publicly. They'll say he's not an anarchist. She won't do that. And it's possible, it's not clear what exactly is going on here. Maybe she feels kind of responsible for what happened, and maybe feels that she accidentally encouraged him. But after this point, she'll actually kind of withdraw from the anarchist movement for a few years. And when she kind of comes back politically, when she reemerges politically, will be, I mean, I would say still, like, pretty out there on the left, but more focused on what I'd call, like, liberal progressive causes than kind of outright anarchist ones.
Interesting. I am curious. I'm sure that somewhere in her writing she goes into more detail about this, but I also am wondering if there's a little bit of disillusionment with how the anarchist movement does not actually seem to be handling intersectionality very well.
I mean, I suspect that's part of it. Broadly, what happens after this point, Goldman will kind of withdraw from the, like, public anarchist work she's been doing, spend a lot of time in New York under an assumed name because she can't use her real one to rent places. She'll be denied them. Living with her brother Moishe/Morris, also having an affair with one of the friends of Moishe/Morris, as one does. And basically stay out of politics until 1903. What leads her back in 1903, New York and New Jersey will pass anti-anarchist laws, and the United States will actually pass a ban on anarchists naturalizing as American citizens, the first such, but not the last in American history. That's why if you become a U.S. citizen, for example, you still get asked if you're a member of the Communist Party. So that's obviously very politically inciting for her. There's also back in Russia, where she grew up. This is the year of the Kishinev pogrom, one of the biggest attacks on Jews in Tsarist Russia, and also of anti-government rioting in St. Petersburg. And sort of following that from afar starts to draw her back into politics. But at this point, her focus changes a little bit. It's less kind of, again, public speaking. Instead, she'll focus on a magazine. She'll start a magazine called Mother Earth that promotes her kind of brand of anarchism. We don't really have room to talk about it here because there's a lot of stuff still to go through, but it's really interesting. I recommend, if you're at all interested in the subject or the period, checking it out. And starting to work more, again, with what I'd call, like, prominent liberals, prominent progressives in American politics. Around this time, she'll make common cause with Clarence Darrow, one of the great defenders of free speech in American history, trying to fight the deportation of resident aliens, non-American citizens who are anarchists. So I see, my read is that she's kind of shifting more towards more away from the kind of long-term anarchist vision and more towards the sort of short-term, like, what can I do kind of social program style, but still very much, like, her stated politics have not changed. Long term, she is, like, in favor of an anarchist society.
Interesting. Okay. So we are a criminal records podcast, and it doesn't sound like she's committing any crimes for a while. So how does she tangle with the law next? Because it seems like she's backing away from some of the inflammatory rhetoric.
So the next time she'll run afoul of the law, it'll be a little while down the road. 13 years later, in 1914. And by this point, she's really transitioned into being what I would call, like, a political celebrity. By 1908, she is touring again. From then until 1917, she will be on speaking tours at least half of the time every year. And drawing in a crowd of a few hundred to a few thousand for every lecture, averaging 3 to 5 lectures a week throughout the course of the overall year. In 1910, she visits 37 cities in 25 states with 120 lectures to a total of 40,000 people. By 1915, 321 lectures in a year to between 50 and 75,000 people.
That is an
Um,
exhausting schedule. Oh my God.
she is keeping busy. And I mean, people are excited to see her. That's part of it. Like, obviously, she's controversial. You know, maybe this woman was behind the assassination of the president. That does, that pulls people in. But she's also, everyone who sees her talks about her being an incredible speaker. I found a description of one of her speeches to the Chicago Press Club in November 1914. This is by the reporter Margaret Anderson. Picture a large club dining room filled with about 500 hard-faced men. Imagine their cynical indifference as she begins to speak amid all the clattering of dishes and the rushing of waitresses. Then imagine the stillness that gradually descends upon them as she poured out her magnificent denouncement. Her subject was the relationship of anarchism to literature, and she talked to those men about making their lives and work free and true and beautiful in a way that would pull the heart out of anything but a veteran newspaperman. "You are mental prostitutes," she hurled at them. "You sell yourselves and your work to your editors or your publishers. There is no such thing as a free man among you. You say what you're told to say, whether it's the truth or not. You must not have an opinion of your own. You dare not have any ideas. You'd die of indigestion if you had. It is men like you who are responsible for the public crimes, such as the hanging of my 5 anarchist comrades in this city 27 years ago." That's the Haymarket riots and their aftermath. She berated them for an hour. She told them what her anarchism means, how it can contribute to the living of a rich life. "You call it a dream, gentlemen. Well, I plead guilty. But when we can't dream any longer, we die. That's what's the matter with you. You've lost your dreams." She sat down under an applause that burst like bullets.
Fascinating. Okay, so she is at the same time that there's this huge panic about anarchism going on in the press, which I'm sure is selling a lot of newspapers. Newspaper clubs, press clubs are actually inviting her to give speeches as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. She's a celebrity. She's kind of famous. But then she falls afoul of something, actually a subject that we've talked about before on this podcast, and something that we probably should do more on at some point. Demetria, would you like to explain to our listeners what the Comstock laws are?
Oh boy. Okay. That was actually, I would say, one of the first scripts I wrote for this podcast, and I was not a very good script writer and got a little in over my head. But there's actually a surprisingly harsh, I would say, legal code about what you can and cannot send by mail. So even if it is legal to say something, or even if it is legal to write something, it may not necessarily be legal to distribute it by mail in the United States. And there's a level on which that makes sense. Like obviously sending explosives through the post. There's a lot of substances that are legal to own, but not legal to send in the mail for safety reasons. But the Comstock laws were the era when some of these laws were applied to things like pamphlets about how to safely use birth control, pamphlets about how free love. A lot of the conversation about free love. Emma Goldman was definitely not the only person involved in that conversation, and a lot of people got nabbed on charges in this era for distributing things that were perfectly legal to say, but not perfectly legal to post.
You know who one of those people was? Future episode subject Margaret Sanger. I think we can just call that shot right now.
Oh yeah, we should do Margaret Sanger. I keep wanting to do abortion episodes and then getting a little bit too upset doing the research, especially in the current political climate. But I really should get on that.
That's fair, I think. But I mean, Sanger is very, worth noting here. Obviously, a very prominent figure in the spread of kind of birth control discussions in the U.S. Actually, the one who coins the phrase birth control in the English language. And Goldman is a huge fan of Margaret Sanger's. For a while, they'll be pretty politically close. Eventually, they'll drift apart because Sanger will, as she goes on, become more politically conservative in kind of her non-birth control related views.
Sanger, for all of the wonderful things that she did do for the country, was a little racist, more than a little racist, I'd say. She did not really fit in that well with a lot of left wing ideology.
Yeah, and Goldman is not the kind of person who lets that sort of thing lie. So before long, things blow up between them. But for a time, they are pretty kind of close. Particularly once Sanger and her husband are both arrested under the Comstock laws. I believe in 1914. Oh, yeah, August 1914. For distributing pamphlets through the U.S. mail, as well as giving lectures talking about birth control and abortion, because some states, including their home state of New York, also pass laws around speech advocating for immoral acts, like birth control, as it was called at the time. And so once that happens, Goldman will start promoting Sanger as well, start promoting Sanger's magazine, The Woman Rebel, at her rallies, and openly declare her support for Sanger, and also take some of her rallies to talk not about anarchism, but this is how a condom works. This is how other forms of birth control work. Basically giving sex ed classes in the middle of her politics lectures.
Wow. Okay,
And
so a lecture from Emma Goldman could be like some yelling about anarchy and then switch to the condom demonstration. Like you could really just get it all in one go.
I believe she would usually say in advance what the focus was going to be. I imagine there was some jumping around, but a great speaker, so I imagine people were entertained no matter what. And it's worth noting that generally, this is true of a lot of leftist movements. The IWW, for example, also gets into talking about birth control. So do socialists during this period. So she's not the only one who's doing this, but she's one of the most prominent, which is probably why on February 11th, 1916, she is arrested in New York State for giving a lecture on birth control, despite the fact that she'd already done that, actually, in New York without any issue. As far as I could find, the only previous time she'd gotten dinged for this was getting a fine in Portland for, quote, circulating literature of an illegal character. But she actually got that overturned on appeal. But this time, she is charged with violating what was then Section 1142 of the New York Penal Code, which, quote, makes it a misdemeanor for a person to sell, give away, or advertise, or offer for sale any instrument or article, drug, or medicine for the prevention of conception, or to give information orally stating when, where, or how such an instrument, article, or medicine can be purchased or obtained. And so, Goldman gets busted under this. Sanger will as well, actually, and end up losing a Supreme Court case in New York over it. One of the kind of landmark cases in the history of birth control law in the U.S. For us, what matters, Goldman gets tried in New York on April 20th, 1916. Apparently 500 people try to get into the courtroom. There's only space for 200. She gives an impassioned speech basically saying, fuck you, yeah, I did it, but birth control is necessary, and is immediately convicted. The charge is a misdemeanor charge, so it's either a $150 fine or 15 days in the workhouse. She picks the workhouse, 15 days in, released on May 4th. But it just makes her more of a celebrity. Like Rose Pastor Stokes, who is one of the big liberal figures of the birth control movement, not an anarchist, right? Kind of a center leftist, will set up a free Emma Goldman rally and be there to meet her with thousands of followers when she's released from prison. It just makes her more of this kind of cross movement figure who has this following outside of anarchist circles. But then comes her third legal issue.
You're smiling in a way that makes me think that this one's going to be a real doozy. And
this is a humdinger.
The fact that you didn't let me interject that much talking about birth control law makes me think we are saving up for something that is really going to be.
Oh no! Please jump in on that, because now we're going to talk about treason.
Ooh, okay.
Sedition. Technically.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say, at this time, we are pre-pill birth control here. So what she is being dinged for here really is just barrier birth controls, right? Like that
is my understanding. Yes,
the condom. So that is pre our current debate over birth control and what conception is. It's purely just you are not allowed to jizz in someone and not get them pregnant.
Yeah, and this is why, because assholes like this used to make it illegal to do the stuff that's now done in high school health classes, this is why they should not be allowed to have any say over these things. Anyway, let's talk about treason.
All right, let's do it.
So, we all remember, of course, that in November 1916, the new American president, Woodrow Wilson, will be reelected primarily because he promised to keep us out of war. That was his campaign slogan, keep us out of war. And of course, we all remember what happens next, which is that in April 1917, Woodrow Wilson does not keep us out of war, and in fact, the US enters World War I. And this is a big moment in American history. It's kind of the emergence of America as a major world power. More importantly for us, Wilson realizes that his initial plan to fill out the US Army with volunteers is not going to work. Only 73,000 people volunteer in the first month and a half of the war, and Wilson wants to bump up the army tenfold from 100,000 people to 1 million. So that's just not going to work.
Yeah, it turns out not a lot of Americans were interested in getting involved in this European spat.
Yeah, it turns out. And so, in May of 1917, Wilson arranges for Congress to pass a selective service law to fill out the armed forces by conscription. He also puts a lot of money into trying to propagandize for the war effort with people like George Creel, an investigative journalist, who is charged with leading the Committee on Public Information, basically a mass propaganda effort to support the war. But there's some sticks with these carrots, too. In June 1917, Congress passes and Wilson signs the Espionage Act. So, the Espionage Act will target anyone who, and I'm going to quote the text of the original law, quote, "When the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, or to promote the success of its enemies, and whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States to the injury of the service or of the United States."
Uh-oh, this is giving a lot of power over people who may have some reasonable objections to the recruitment of a lot of young American men going off to fight.
If you like that, you're going to love this. Because in May of 1918, Congress amends this, what is called the Sedition Law of 1918, adding a whole new section. This part targets, quote, "Anyone whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements, blah, 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 or shall willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully display the flag of any foreign enemy, or shall willfully urge, incite, or advocate any curtailment of production, or advocate, teach, defend, or suggest the doing of any of the acts or things in this section enumerated, and whoever shall by word or act support or favor the cause of any country with which the United States is at war, or by word or act oppose the cause of the United States therein."
Oh boy, okay.
Yeah, you can't even wave a German flag, or you are subject to 20 years in prison or a $10,000 fine. That's a little over $250,000 adjusted for inflation today.
Yeah, thinking back to what I know in this period, there's quite a large and not fully assimilated group of German immigrants in the country, but I have the feeling that is not what this law is going after here.
It's used to go after a lot of people. The sedition laws are eventually repealed in 1920 because they are found to go a little bit too far, shockingly.
Just a smidge into First Amendment territory there. Yeah, just a little skosh.
But the Espionage Act is found constitutional by the Supreme Court in 1919. It technically is still on the books, though it has been amended substantially in later years. I think the Rosenbergs were executed under the Espionage Act. I believe there was talk, or there currently are, some indictments against Donald Trump related to the Espionage Act. It's still around, so that, that's a thing. But that's a law that exists in World War I. This is also a time of a real upwelling of what we would call nationalistic sentiment, anti-immigrant xenophobia, just generally people being racist as fuck. There's a lot of accusation that the war effort is being undermined by foreign-born agitators, particularly, we all know who. We all know who's really behind it. Some sort of international conspiracy.
What group of foreign born people who moved en masse to the United States, most of them from a country that is doing something quite fascinating in
Getting a
1917?
little getting a little left pilled, getting a little commie pilled there.
Oh,
Yeah,
what group of people known for associating with Bolsheviks in the 1910s might, and then having quite a falling out, I would
you
say.
know who knows? You know who can give us those answers? Henry Ford.
Oh, Henry Ford, a notable race scientist, Henry
Yes,
Ford.
noticeable guy who would later pal around with Hitler. Don't buy Fords. I hold a grudge. Yeah, there's a lot of like very like sometimes open, mostly very latent anti-Jewish sentiment ramped up in all of this, but also just general hatred of anyone who's not a WASP, essentially. This is it's just kind of the zeitgeist of the moment. In 1916, there's a very influential book called The Passing of the Great Race that does numbers in the US and basically is an argument that Nordic people are superior. It's basically like Nazi eugenics science, and it does huge numbers in the US. It's very influential on the passing of the Immigration Act of 1924, which is the one that bars all Asians from coming to the US, heavily restricts European immigration from anywhere other than like WASP countries. That's why all those Jews who tried to flee to America got turned back around and sent to death camps. So, really, just a cool moment in American politics. Really cool and normal.
Yeah, this was back when the boundaries of whiteness were quite tighter than they are today.
I think that's a very good academic framing of it. Less academic is when Emma Goldman's offices get raided by federal officers in June of 1917. By the way, they don't have a warrant actually, or they don't show it when she asks for it at least. And she is arrested before being charged. 10 days. She's held for 10 days, which actually you can't do, but they just do it. And then charged with violating the Espionage Act and released on $25,000 worth of bail. I'm not sure how she got that money, but honestly, impressive. Uh, so they are put on trial, Berkman and Goldman, because Berkman is now out of prison by now. He's gotten out of his 20-year prison sentence just to go back. They are charged with misusing funds donated to their anti-war campaign, which is called the No Conscription League. They're charged with accepting German money in violation of the Espionage Act, which is just a charge, from what I can tell, that the government threw at anyone who is an anti-war activist without evidence. They're charged with advocating anti-government violence and charged with conspiring to prevent draft registration, which is an Espionage Act violation. The trial itself, again, I would say is kind of a mess. It's basically them being put on trial for their political views. A lot of it is Goldman getting grilled basically on, like, do you support anti-government violence? Her response, by the way, is, quote, I don't, or she says, I don't, but, quote, to simply condemn the man who has committed an act of political violence to save my own skin would be just as unpardonable as it would be on the part of a physician who is called upon to diagnose a case to condemn the patient because the patient has tuberculosis or cancer or any other disease. Alex Berkman's a little more succinct. He says, we all believe in violence and we all disbelieve in violence. It depends on the circumstances. This trial is probably, I would say, the most famous because at the end, Goldman gives a 2-hour long speech summing up her defense. It is substantial, but I would like to quote from at least two different parts of it, if you'll allow me. The first, quote, an act of political violence at the bottom is the culminating result of organized violence on top. It is the result of violence which expresses itself in war, which expresses itself in capital punishment, which expresses itself in courts, which expresses itself in prison, which expresses itself in kicking and housing people for the only crime they are guilty of, having been born poor. So that's, her kind of summing up the accusation that she is engaged in political violence by saying the government is really the violent party here. I also really like, there's a moment in the speech that's very famous when she talks about American patriotism, and this is another area where I find myself very strongly agreeing with Emma Goldman. Who is the real patriot, or rather, what is the kind of patriotism we represent? The kind of patriotism we represent is the kind of patriotism which loves America with open eyes. Our relation towards America is the same as the relation of a man who loves a woman, who is enchanted by her beauty and yet cannot be blind to her defects. And so I wish to state here, in my own behalf and in behalf of hundreds of thousands whom you decry and state to be anti-patriotic, that we love America. We love her beauty, we love her riches, we love her mountains and her forests, and above all, we love the people who have produced her wealth and riches, who have created all her beauty. We love the dreamers and the philosophers and the thinkers who are giving America liberty. But that must not make us blind to the social faults of America. That cannot make us deaf to the discords of America. That cannot compel us to be inarticulate to the terrible wrongs committed in the name of patriotism and the name of country. We simply insist, regardless of all protests to the contrary, that this is not a war for democracy. If it were a war for the purpose of making democracy safe for the world, we would say that democracy must first be safe for America before it can be safe for the world.
All right. Once again, I am picking up what Emma Goldman is putting down here. I would agree with that.
Yeah, I would say it is a solid speech. And yet, not terribly convincing. On Monday, July 9th, the jury goes into deliberation. Deliberation takes 39 minutes. And then they are found guilty, from what I can tell, on every charge. Judge Julius Mayer gives them the maximum sentence available based on the charges: 2 years in prison, $10,000 fine each. Again, that's about $236,000 today. And because, according to the government, they are not American citizens, both Berkman and Goldman, possible deportation at the end of the sentence.
Oh boy. Okay. That's going to be pretty rough probably for them, because they are being deported to a country that is going through some changes.
Yeah, so this is where things get a little legally spicy. Alex Berkman never bothered to naturalize as an American citizen, so it's pretty open and shut legally for him. Goldman will claim, remember back in episode 1, we talked about her shitty marriage to a guy whose name I even forgot to put in the notes because he's such a non-entity. He was the creepy weirdo who threatened to kill himself when she broke up with him. She'll say, he was an American citizen, I married him, so I get marriage citizenship. At this point, the laws in the US around that are pretty hazy. We don't start clarifying those until the mid-20th century, when it's a way to keep out the undesirables. And so the government contends when they got divorced, she also gave up any claim to the process of naturalization, which she didn't complete formally, and so she's not a citizen.
Okay. So she's basically been bunged in prison for 2 years on the we don't like the way you talk charges. And
Pretty
then
much.
She gets out, and then what's going to happen to her?
So she is released on September 27th, 1919, getting ready to have to fight her deportation at possibly the worst possible moment because, and here's another future episode, she's getting out right in time for what we call the first Red Scare. Most of us, I think, when we say the words Red Scare, we think of the McCarthy period, which we've covered before on this podcast. That's the second Red Scare. The first one is in 1919, this massive wave of anti-leftist conspiracy talk led by the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, who is convinced that there is this leftist plan to take over the country, that May Day riots, which happen in 1919, are a Bolshevik conspiracy. Actually, they're instigated by right-wing politicians and their followers attacking socialist demonstrators. That race riots happening in 12 cities in the summer of 1919 are the fault of communist agitators and not the fact that black people don't like being treated like they're not human. That a strike by Boston cops in September is not a labor dispute, but just a communist infiltration of the police union. Having a real normal one, I would say, A. Mitchell Palmer is right now. And so he turns to a series of plans to raid leftist political groups and stop the revolution, led by his protege and probably also a future subject, though unfortunately he never did any prison time that I'm aware of. At this point, he is the head of the Radical Division, charged with hunting radicals of the Bureau of Investigation, what will become the FBI, Mr. J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh boy. Okay, Hoover Hoover was so good at getting himself worked up over things that he had to excise from the country.
Yes, future Martin Luther King is a communist, J. Edgar Hoover. Um, oh, we should just do an episode on Martin Luther King. That'd be fun. I'm sure we'd get some real normal comments on that. Anyway.
Oh man, especially because you definitely teach your students some of that history that I would say gets whitewashed out of a lot of textbooks.
I do my best to be a little more honest about what Martin Luther King actually believed. Anyway, this whole atmosphere is not great and leads to moments like this. This is an actual headline from the United Press on January 3rd, 1920. Revolution is prevented. Radical elements were on the verge of fusion, intending to elect Bolshevist candidates next president and set up Soviet government, headquarters maintained in Moscow. 4,500 radicals, both men and women, most of them members of the Communist and Communist Labor parties, were arrested last night and early today in a nationwide roundup by federal authorities. The raids, according to the Department of Justice, averted a move to establish a Soviet government in the United States.
Wait a second here. The argument that he's going with is these tricky communists who were secretly hiding everywhere. What they were going to do is use legitimate democracy to enact the will of the people.
Yes, with the help of anarchists, who you might know if you have any familiarity with Russian history. The Bolsheviks shot all the anarchists when they took over. They don't agree on much except they don't like capitalism. So anyway, Emma Goldman is being followed by police from the moment she's released from prison. Despite that, she still goes on a speaking tour in November 1919, well under the threat of deportation. Her deportation hearing is on October 27th. She'll give this whole defense, I'm an American citizen, I deserve these protections, and basically give a defiant speech, accusing the government of putting her on trial for the crime of having opinions. I have a link to it in here, but I don't think we need to get into it. We have plenty to talk about already.
I mean, yeah, she is correct on that one. That is exactly what they did.
But shockingly, she will not win. She is deported from the United States alongside Alex Berkman and 247 other people as a part of the Palmer raids on Sunday, December 21st, 1919. They are loaded into a ship, the SS Buford, from Ellis Island, where they had been locked up, and shipped off to Russia. I do want to note that just a few weeks before this, on December 2nd, Henry Clay Frick finally died and presumably went to the hell that he desperately deserves. And that Alex Berkman, when he was asked about this by a reporter, he was asked for comment, did say that Frick had been, quote, deported by God. And that is a very solid burn, and I really wanted to note it.
I gotta say though, Emma Goldman, not a big religion fan. I'm not sure if wishing her enemies to hell was her style.
That is probably fair. So from this point on, Goldman will only briefly come back to the United States many years later. She'll first live in the Soviet Union for a while in the aftermath of the revolution. But it would turn out, this Lenin guy, not super interested in human rights. And so she would leave the country on December 1st, 1921. She'd basically sneak out claiming she's going to attend an anarchist conference and then just never come back, and write a really fascinating text called My Disillusionment in Russia, where she'll talk about why she left. And is pretty scathing in her critique of Leninism.
I mean, yeah, knowing what Emma Goldman was really focused on as some of the weaknesses within the anarchist movement, and knowing how a lot of the communist regime ends up continuing to enshrine some really iffy things about gender and sexuality and the family and things like that. I would imagine that she would not have fit in very well there.
Yeah, I'd say she called that one pretty well. Eventually, she'll go to Berlin, then leave there for England, and then end up living, of course, in the great progressive haven that is Canada, mostly in Toronto. And will live there for most of the rest of her life. In 1934, she'll briefly be allowed back into the U.S. as part of a press tour for her autobiography, which she'll write during this time, but she'll mostly move between Europe and Canada while lecturing. And I found a bunch of great coverage of her lectures. We don't have time, of course, for all of them, but I wanted to note one at Hygeia Hall in Toronto in January of 1934. That is about the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany 1 year after their takeover. The article covering it and quoting Goldman, I'll have her say, quote, "They, the Nazi leadership, are all either mental defectives, sexual perverts, or vicious criminal types. Hitler began his life as a perfectly good house painter," the famous anarchist stated. "The world might have had some use for him if he had stuck to house painting." She will then pretty openly call for someone to assassinate Hitler. So, that's pretty cool.
You know what? I feel like maybe I've been too down on assassination in this episode. Emma, I completely agree with you on that one.
I want to, just I recall the words of my stepfather, a very wise man, who says that sometimes in life you have to rise above your principles, and I think this is a good example of that. After the start of the Spanish Civil War, she'll pretty openly rally support for the Republican cause and just be generally, like, a lot of her later career is focused on advocating against fascism. And, called that one pretty well. So she will suffer a stroke, though, eventually in February of 1940. After a brief recovery, she'll have a second one in May, and she'll die shortly thereafter, which brings us to the end of Goldman's career. She does eventually get permission to come back to the U.S. Her body is given permission by the Immigration and Naturalization Service to come back to America so that she could be buried per her request in the Forest Home Cemetery in Illinois, right next to the burial plots for the people executed in the Haymarket Affair, which is, of course, what inspired her to anarchism. And there's a quote on her tombstone, which I do really like. "Liberty will not descend to a people must raise themselves to liberty." And that is the story of Emma Goldman.
Wow. Really, really interesting figure in history. Really interesting. I feel like often sometimes when we are teaching history and we are teaching larger social movements, we tend to present history as, oh, everyone in this time believed this or something. And we don't tend to talk about some of the dissidents and some of the ways that people throughout history had some ideas that are still pretty modern today. And I think this is a good example of even 100 years ago, Emma Goldman had some ideas that still seem perfectly fresh today. Had some weird ones too, but some feel really, really fresh.
And I think, that's what's really interesting to me about Goldman is that you can read her so many different ways. I loved a piece I found by Oz Frankel talking about the legacy of Goldman, basically saying that after her death, her legacy has gone through all these different reinterpretations, particularly in the 60s. She becomes like a kind of foundational figure of second wave feminism and third wave feminism. And so he says, quote, "Goldman may be presented as a fighter for free speech, a communitarian, a libertarian, an anti-communist, an extreme individualist, a precursor of modern feminism, a true subversive, a harmless visionary expelled for voicing innocent ideas, a suffering victim, a cheerful, life-affirming woman, or an amusing, sharp-tongued Jewish grandmother. There is the tough political Goldman and the nurturing, gentle spirit Emma." Which I do think is really true. Like, my exposure to Goldman is very much comes through my experience with what, like, more liberal Judaism, where despite the fact that she mostly disavows Judaism in her lifetime, these days she is like the cool aunt of all left-wing Jews. Like, she has this kind of popularity among the kind of more left-wing Jewish communities, including like more religious left-wing Jewish communities. But then if you go into more of the anarchist circles, that's not really emphasized at all. It's more of the kind of like hyper-individualism, the kind of inheritance of the Kropotkinite ideal. There are so many different ways you can look at Goldman, kind of based on the ways in which she's been reinterpreted as a figure kind of in the years after her death.
Interesting. Yeah, I know that we tend to joke about how often leftist movements splinter, but I feel like this is a good example of why some of those splinters are necessary and why Goldman was really pushing back against quite a few different movements. Really, the anarchist movement was clearly something that wanted her to be something that she was not willing to be. And obviously the communist movement, definitely not a place where she would fit in particularly well.
And it's one of the things I really, like, as I did this research, came to respect about her. She is uncompromising. She is an anarchist her whole life and stands by it. but she is capable of reaching across political divides and like talking to people, even in a very abrasive way, but still a way that like shows respect and serious engagement, and is able to like make allies by doing that. And that, just to kind of call it as I see it, is not something I see every left-wing person out there being terribly good at doing. But if you actually want to accomplish stuff, it seems pretty important. And it's like, so I don't think I would have agreed with Emma Goldman. I think on everything, I think she would have yelled at me quite a bit. But I feel like we could have found some things we'd be willing to work on together. And that is pretty important for like making the world a better place.
Yeah, I would say a lot of my life, I would say, is shaped by ideas that Emma Goldman advanced in her time. A lot of my friends' lives is shaped by ideas that Emma Goldman advanced in her time. I feel like we could have had some really great arguments in college. I would not have agreed with her on everything, but wow, she really was ahead of her time in a lot of things.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other thing that's worth remembering here is, if you're an American, the flaws of the American justice system. I agree very strongly with Goldman's views on American patriotism as she laid them out. I'm fond of this country, but we have a lot of problems. And the ways in which people like Goldman were handled during a period of political hysteria are a great example of why it is important not to give in to that kind of hysteria and actually like not just go with this very kind of emotive, like, oh, I'm scared the commies are going to take over, so I'll do anything to stop that, and just ignore the evidence. Like, the dangers of that, I think, are substantial, and what happens to her is a great example of why they are substantial.
Yeah, I would say that she's a combination of things that maybe were kind of iffy from a legal perspective, like things that maybe one might argue she really should not have been legally punished for at all. And things that she started out doing perfectly legally, and then the law changed over her, specifically to suppress people like her.
Yeah, I think it is worth noting that every single instance where she ran afoul of the law, either there was no evidence that she did anything illegal, or those laws were stupid. And, I think today the consensus would be, at least unless you're like, I'm like a lunatic, like proto-fascist, that those laws were wrong morally. So, definitely on the right side of history.
Yeah. So we get to talk about her on this podcast because of her criminal convictions, and yet I would say we are she deserves to be remembered as a lot more than a criminal. The criminalization happened to stop her from saying some things that I would say mostly very still worth talking about.
Yes, and gives us opportunities to continue dunking on the Comstock laws and on J. Edgar Hoover, which I think, there's a lot to work with there.
Oh boy, I should do like the lavender scare sometime too. J. Edgar Hoover was just fantastic at a good scare. He loved to be scared.
A very scared man. And admittedly, if my face looked like his, I'd be nervous too. So if you want to tell us how much, or if our listeners want to tell us how much they hate J. Edgar Hoover, where can they find us?
You can find us on facingbackward.com.
You can also support the network and find out more about what we're working on. See some of our projects at patreon.com/facingbackward. We even have a special, somewhat secret podcast for Patreon backers where we yell about movies. It's great fun.
Oh, you want to hear us really rip into Napoleon?
I mean, I had a great time. I had more fun doing that than I did watching the movie. That's patreon.com/facingbackward if you want to check that out.
And special shout out to folks who signed up with the shout out tier. You are Ian Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCullough, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuda, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Rees, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shumao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A house is a perfectly cromulent mascot. The fish I catch are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, who I'm sure Emma Goldman would have agreed was a schmuck. And everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
Until next time, folks, try not to get implicated in the assassination of William McKinley.